All right, time to check the weather now. Let's go to David Jones at Environment Canada.
Thanks, Rick. Out here on the west coast, we've got intermittent showers, some fog in low-lying areas. The temperature about 12 to 15 degrees, but we do expect some sunny breaks later in the day. Looks to me like another one of those Toni Onley days.
In this part of the world, David, every day is a Toni Onley day.
I'm a pretty much of a loner, you know. I live alone and fly alone. I was born on the Isle of Man, which is a sort of British protectorate, but it's an independent country. It's in the Irish Sea. I was born there in 1928. My father was an actor, and my mother was a mother. It's a wonderful place to grow up, you know, because there were very few distractions of any kind. So I had to sort of identify with my surroundings, identify with the island somehow, and painting seems to be an ideal thing to do. And I always painted, you know, right from the time I was a child at school. When I was about 13 or so, I started going painting with a John Hobbs Nicholson. He would go out with his favored students at the weekends, and I wanted to join that crowd. I wanted to go out painting with him. And he was a very fine watercolor painter in a sort of a 19th century tradition, but I wanted to learn, you know, like the scales of a piano. I wanted to learn how to handle watercolor. But anyway, I asked him, I plucked up courage. I was only about 13. I said, you know, could I join you the weekend? You know, you cycle out manfully and do hairy-chested outdoor watercolors. I'd like to join you, you know. And he says, well, if you can keep up. I joined him, and you know, I was probably his best pupil because, you know, when it was, the weather wasn't so good or it was cold and everybody else dropped out, I mean, John and I go off painting together. That sort of influenced my pattern of painting for the rest of my life, I think. I don't use a bicycle anymore, of course. You know, I don't go out to the landscape on a bicycle. I have a flying boat now. It was after the war. My father came home for lunch one day and he said, we're leaving, we're getting out of here. And within a week we were on the old Aquitania and we're sailing across the Atlantic to Halifax.
From Halifax, he made his way to Ontario, where he met Mary Burroughs and had 2 kids. Then Tony's wife died. He went to Mexico and there he found himself in a place where it was cheap to live. San Miguel is a sort of artist's colony.
When I was living in Mexico, I painted for a full year just doing Mexican landscapes, and I just hated them. And one day I tore everything up and it was scattered all over my studio floor. And then I looked down and I saw these papers laying one on top of the other, and I saw shapes and patterns and things emerging that would have broken my arm, you know, 5 minutes before to paint that, actually. So I pick about 3 pieces of paper up, you know, together, and I pinned them to another piece of paper on the wall. And before I knew it, I'd created something entirely different. I mean, these were abstract collages. The rest of my 2-year stay in Mexico, I was doing collages. When I came back to Vancouver, I mean, nobody'd seen anything like this, and I was sort of an instant hit in a way.
I'm very fond of and I think they're very important works, the early abstractions. I think he was producing work that was amongst the most interesting that was being produced in Canada. It was bought by the Tate Gallery. It was recognized as being very significant. What he was able to do was take works of art that he didn't think were really particularly succeeding and sort of rip them up and sort of move them around and then find ways where they had a certain degree of dynamic tension on the surface of the image and then glue it all down and then create, you know, pure abstractions that don't have a particular narrative sense to them.
After I'd sold a few of these paper-on-paper collages, I had enough money I could go out and buy canvas. I mean, for the first time I had canvas in my possession. I did a whole series of canvas collages.
This early collage work, I guess you could say it reached its apex with his mural in 1962, which he did for the Playhouse. It was the largest thing he did. He had trouble getting it out of his studio. He had to actually cut it into 3 pieces and have it move from that studio.
In the summer of 2002, the Evergreen Cultural Center in Coquitlam staged an exhibition of Toni's collages. We were particularly interested in showing the work that went back almost 50 years in comparison with what was being done today. And beyond that, we wanted to show some of the work that is not typically seen. You could see a thread that ran through over the years, which were distinctively his palette, his strong sense of design, and they were unmistakably Toni's works.
The attitude that goes into my collages goes into my watercolors. It's the same. I don't see any big difference, except with one I'm dealing with a subject matter, with the other I'm dealing with pure abstract form. I'm probably better known for my 60s work, where I'm dealing with 1 or 2 shapes and that sort of thing and playing around them like a chess game, relating to the framed edge of the painting sort of thing. You know, I still do that in my paintings. Even my landscape paintings now, I'm concerned about the relationship between the edge of the painting and what's happening in the painting, and getting a spark between the shapes in the painting.
Where Onley is interesting is he never became a realist. He always retains a certain degree of abstraction, of distance within those landscapes, and gives it a more timeless kind of quality. The use of color on his watercolor palette in particular is very directly connected to the nature of the landscape in which he's depicting. It's cool, but it's warm at the same time. It's inviting at the same time, encourages you to enter into that landscape with him.
My experience in painting comes from the light in this area. You know, the black light of British Columbia, which I love, you know. The lakes look like they're bottomless. The black water. I love that northern light, as opposed to the sort of the white light of early morning in California. The light is on the surface. The light doesn't penetrate. Ghosts can't live in California, but they can live in our forests. This is where my sort of soul is here. And I respond to that northern temperament. It's the timeless things that I'm looking for all the time. It's the things that don't date, the things that are there now and have always been there. And this is what feeds my art.
That commitment to watercolor is rather unusual in terms of the strength and depth of that commitment, because often for other artists it's been a fairly subsidiary aspect of their activity, but for Onley it's been a very major and central aspect of his activity. There has always been historically a feeling that watercolors are lesser things somehow. And I think that, you know, Onley's commitment to watercolor is indicated that really they're not lesser things.
Toni Onley has modernized the technique of watercolor. We can say that he is widely influenced by Oriental art. For example, the empty space is as important as the spaces that are filled. It is extremely powerful. The other would be Japanese calligraphy, and mostly the tools used by artists. And you know, we have all seen these beautiful Japanese brushes that he's using. So there is an Oriental feeling. It's mingling the Western tradition with the Oriental tradition.
He felt something in common between his own aesthetic and also Japanese traditional aesthetics. I'm talking about Zen aesthetic, which to do with simplicity and minimalism, actually a lot to do with empty space. Japanese are very good at emphasizing empty space.
Japanese painters, they don't draw before they paint. I mean, for one thing, they're working on rice paper, you know, and they're reacting to what's happening as it's happening on the paper. They may sit and contemplate the blank sheet of paper for a while, which I do. Mostly the scale of what I'm about to do. You know, well, I sit and look at a landscape like that for a long time and then decide what I'm going to select out of it, you know. And I pay attention to the light and the weather and mostly I'm trying to capture the light, you know, and the objects in the painting are just objects to shine the light on.
The watercolors, they are so caught on the fly, and yet they function best as a personal object of contemplation. And this, to my mind, is where Toni's sort of Asian sensibility comes in. The idea of not public artwork, but private objects that you keep close to you.
Everything is very muted, very serene, tranquil. It definitely has an Oriental flavor to it, and he's the absolute consummate expert at this type of painting. But they have a very spiritual quality, and being a musician, that resonates with me.
It's a very Japanese way of painting. It's, you know, they call it the song of the brush.
The dab of paint goes on, and it stays there, and that's it. There's no messing around. It's done, and it stands there. It's delicious, and everybody loves it.
Toni has his own style. It's very distinctive. You recognize a Toni Onley as soon as you see it. It's not a picture postcard. It's a beautiful evocation of a place. Those are the things that make Toni popular. He's the poet of the landscape. He's the poet of the West Coast mists, is what he is.
Landscape is the starting point. And what's intriguing about his work, I think, is that he frequently moves to an extremely pictorial style. Other times we're looking at great washes of color and form, which are almost completely abstract. But the purpose of it being there is not because he saw a log there, but because that particular form belongs in that particular painting. The key thing is the way the artist's eye sees the landscape and the way in which the artist's hand follows the artist's imagination in interpreting the landscape.
As soon as you put a mark on the paper, you've narrowed down all your possibilities right there, you know, and that determines the next area you're going to paint, and that determines the next. So you're constantly looking. So at the end of the day, you have something you could never have thought of in the morning. To me, this is the huge thrill of painting. My work emerges as I'm painting. It's emerging, and the painting tells me when it's finished. It says, you know, Toni, don't go any further. I might be in a mid-stroke, and that's it. You know, you've got to be making value judgments as you're going all the time. You just got to feel it, you know. Don't think of the end, think of where you are right now, at this very second where you are right now, and where that's telling you to go in the next second, and the next second, until the painting screams at you. Toni, put the brush down, you're finished.
Tennessee Williams had written a play based on Chekhov's The Seagull. Toni, who was having a colossal amount of visibility and success at the time, was asked to design the sets.
Williams came in August of that year, 1981. As soon as he saw the set, he said, "Who designed this set?" And of course, this led to a meeting with Toni, and the two became friends.
Each time the curtain came up on a new scene, it was a brand new scene. The lighting engineer was obviously brilliant, and he'd taken suggestions from Toni about, you know, how the basic set could be altered to capture the mood of each scene. That was one of the most dramatic and breathtaking and beautiful stage experiences, theatre experiences that I've had.
The thing about Toni is that he realizes what a lot of visual artists don't realize, and that's that you have to promote yourself. You're competing against detergent, you're competing against cornflakes for public attention.
Toni was very much interested in producing art which could be sold and which was sold, and at that point he felt that he was separated by an increasingly wide gulf from the art community. The idea of producing saleable work is a kind of anathema.
Some people say, well, it was a typical Canadian reaction, that Canada has a problem with the success of its own people. It's only when they get huge recognition outside Canada that Canadians will take somebody's success seriously. Probably the thing that thrilled him more than anything was they decided to put some of Toni's landscapes of the Isle of Man onto stamps. Quite big, grand, beautiful stamps, which were very highly sought after collector's pieces. He was absolutely delighted when he was awarded the Order of Canada, which was a bit of a snub on the nose to the local sourpusses. Toni really was pleased about that because he felt that Canada had been exceptionally good to him. There was a lot of sniping, a lot of carping, and a lot of jealousy, which was unnecessary. Toni fanned the flames. He did delight in fanning the flames.
Driving around in his Rolls Royce, flaunting his wealth. He was an ostentatious painter. People think, well, he can't be a very good painter. He's just a promoter. In fact, he's not that. He's a painter in his own right, and the promotion is simply a recognition of the fact that you've got to get out there and sell.
The Arctic was a place I always wanted to go to. For years and years I wanted to go there and paint. I mean, it's part of the Canadian consciousness, and very few Canadians have actually been to their Arctic. It's a realm of the imagination. It's our great outdoors, our great backyard. It's the space that we have that we value so much. It was in, I think, about 1972. I was on holidays in New Brunswick, and my host said, "Oh, guess who's coming to dinner tonight?" And it was Pierre Trudeau and Margaret. I'd known him before he was in politics. And he said to me, he said, "You know, your art always reminded me of the Arctic." And I said, "Well, I've always wanted to go there, but I don't know how to get there. You know, you can't get there from here. Nothing goes there." And he said, "Well, leave that with me."
Pierre Trudeau was very interested in Toni's work and saw an opportunity of bringing Toni to the Arctic, and in other words, bringing the Arctic to Canada.
April 10th, 1974. My dear Onley, I have wonderful news for you. Am I not right in believing that travel to Baffin Island by sea would in fact be a far preferable option for you, and that it would enable you to sketch northern and Arctic scenes on the way there and back? All the best, very sincerely, Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
It's very, very exciting painting in the Arctic, and there's no distractions. You know, I have nothing to do except paint, you know. My landscapes are pretty well ready-made for me up there. You know, it's just like, I just have to look around and, wow, there's a spot, you know, there's a painting right there, you know, so I think so. When you're moving through icebergs, I mean, that is magical because It's like sculpture. It changes its form as you're going around it, you know. So I'd be painting madly, you know, trying to get this down, get it down before, while it's in my mind, before I lose it. I've done 20 paintings a day, you know, because there's 24 hours of daylight, so I just keep on going, you know. And I remember one time I got so involved with my painting, and I turned around and there was one guy on watch on the bridge, and I said, well, where is everybody? He said, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, everybody's in bed. I remember the captain saying to me, well, you know, everybody on the ship's wondering what you're painting, and the guys below deck, they don't see what I'm painting. He said, how would you like to give the crew a show? And so I was showing them my paintings, and one of the crew members said, well, you know, I've been coming up here for 30 years, and it's all white, you know, where do you get these blues and pinks and these colors, you know? I mean, there are no color up here, you know? So I gave them a lesson in perception. I said, you look over here, and you'll see that the shadows are all sort of a mauve blue color. You look over here, and it tends towards pink, actually, you know, and they look and say, I can't see that, you know. I said, well, tuck your head under your arm and look, and you'll be able to see it. And you can. If you look upside down at a landscape, you can see the colors, and you can see the scale of things, too. So the bosun's mate sort of looked out there, and he looked the other way. He says, oh my God, he's right. God, it's all blue out there. You know, I never realized that before, you know, and they all got very excited. And the next day I was passing the captain's office, and he says, Tony, come in here, shut the door. You know, so, oh my God, what have I done? He said, ever since you talked to my crew, he said, about visual conception, he says, they've been going around with their head you know where. That was great.
November 22nd, 1974. My dear Onley, your spectacular watercolor of Took Island has arrived safely. Margaret and I are so enchanted that we cannot thank you warmly enough for it. I enjoyed tremendously reading the account of your painting trip to the Arctic. Your enthusiastic endorsement of the charms of the ancient Thule culture site on Broman Point certainly makes me eager to see it with my own eyes someday. Thank you for telling me about this fascinating place. With every good wish from Margaret and me, sincerely, Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Printmaking has been an extraordinary activity for Onley. He is one of the most distinguished printmakers who's ever worked in British Columbia. Working with Bill Bonnyman, he was able to create these remarkably luminous and translucent kinds of uses of ink, which affect the kind of image that looks sort of like a watercolor even though it's a screen print. And this kind of richness of color and subtlety of color that occurs in these prints is something that really marks him as being a very particular and important printmaker in this part of the world.
Silk screening is a screen process, serigraphy, whatever you want to call it. It's one of the oldest methods around. It's basically putting a stencil down, whatever's stenciled off, the rest of it is all, the surface gets covered. It's basically a process of resistance. Whatever you want to print, you take out. We'd look at his, one of his watercolors or format the same way as he might look at a landscape. Then what happened is that's a point of derivation. We'd do a few little cuts, establish something, put it away, and then occasionally be mesmerized by how far gone we went. You know, we hardly even recognize the original idea. And the whole point of it was that's where the poetry was.
Bill Barneyman was a very fine printmaker. I mean, we started making screen prints together, roughly based on compositional ideas out of watercolors, although I couldn't sort of copy the watercolor because the medium is quite different. But what I was interested in getting was a medium that was transparent, you know, like watercolor, where you lay one color on top of another and you create a third and a fourth and a fifth color. You create a lot of different colors just by a couple of printings. You can do that.
We'll print this whole area along here and right down through here, up through here, following this line, right around the river. This will all be yellow. Then we'll print the sky. That'll be the second printing, will be the sky.
Bill used to say, you know, you can screen anything. I mean, that's what clued me in. He said, you can screen porridge if you want, you know. I said, oh, God, we don't have to use screen ink. We can make our own ink. So I started, you know, mixing my own ink and that kind of thing. I certainly enjoyed making them, you know, because I never knew what it was going to look like when I finished it. Very much like the painting, we would keep going with it and changing it and adding things to it. I just keep going until it happened. It's just like doing one painting, except it's in multiples, you know, it's multiple images.
That's a thing of beauty, a joy forever.
Western Canada Wilderness Committee, they phoned me and they had a problem with the Stein Valley at the time. I mean, this is a valley where young natives would go to find their spiritual animal. You know, they would go when they were teenagers and climb up into caves and sort of starve themselves and have visions until they saw the animal that would guide their life, sort of thing, and then they'd draw it on the cave wall. I mean, I flew in a helicopter up the face of this cliff, and it was this one cave was just full of animal drawings done in red ochre on the walls that, like, for hundreds of years, animals painted over animals, that kind of thing. It was quite a wonderful sight. So it was a spiritual home, you know, to the Lillooet Indians. So when you see it from the air, as I do, I could see that everything around there for miles and miles had already been logged off.
Your opponents, the timber companies, are some of the most politically powerful and wealthy organizations in the country. So how can you go up? How can you even hope to go up against a big, powerful timber company?
And I said, what I'll do is get together a group of artists and maybe get some fellow pilots or people that I know with float planes. We'll fly up there. And we'll spend a weekend up in the valley, and we'll come back and we'll have an exhibition of the paintings, and we'll have a black tie dinner, and we'll do it all at the Hyatt Regency or something, and we'll make a big statement, draw awareness to the problem, but at the same time we'll sell paintings.
At $3,000 on this Toni, only watercolor going for $3,000. It's going $32.50, sir. Thank you. And the 35 and the 35.
Artists in Canada generally work from nature. I mean, we're nature oriented in this country, but particularly in British Columbia.
So with Toni coming involved with this and bringing in a whole community of communicators, artists, I mean, this took the Stein issue and put it on the map.
At $32.50, it's only money, and it's for a wonderful cause.
It was very good, and I got all these Western Canada wilderness people into monkey suits.
Well, Tony's monkey suit idea really taught me a lot. I learned that we're essentially tribal and that we all have our tribal dress that we feel comfortable in. So that when Toni suggested we go out and get tuxedos and that this would be a good thing in protecting the valley, it did take a bit to wrap our minds around.
Third and last time at $4,000. Yours, sir, for $4,000. Thank you.
For now, it's saved, actually. It's saved to the extent that it has park status that I can't even fly in there now.
What Toni had shown us in the Stein was that by bringing in artists, by working with artists, we could actually have success. So once again, he helped put together an even bigger, a much bigger artist project in the Carmana Valley.
They're turning me into a martyr. I mean, what I'm trying to do is to stop Revenue Canada taxing artists across the country as manufacturers. We're not manufacturers.
By definition, artists are individual, essentially, fundamentally. They have to respond to their own muses, their own inspiration.
They do these audits, Revenue Canada do these audits. Anyway, they were about to say, well, you can't claim the costs of any of this until you've sold the work. Well, of course, artists have all got studios full of work. So I did get a ruling from them that if the work didn't exist, the problem didn't exist. I thought, well, you've just told me what to do. I mean, I can always paint more pictures, but I can't paint money. So I decided that I'd burn all my work down on Wreck Beach.
Are you now going to chicken out and not burn your prints? Are you still going to burn the paintings?
Of course I am. I mean, this issue is much bigger than me, Jack, and I've been trying to tell everybody that right from the very beginning. I'm not complaining about my taxes. I'm complaining about the way artists are taxed from coast to coast in Canada.
I have been examined by the tax department, and I have had people who have no knowledge or real information or background in the art world on the telephone constantly asking me questions like, well, why don't you paint smaller pictures? Why don't you give up your large studio and move to a smaller studio? Why don't you put less paint on your canvases? If this business is losing you so much money, why don't you quit and get a proper job, quote.
If they're not allowing Tony to charge the expenses of any of his strips until he's done all the work's done on those strips, this could apply to writers too. They could say to writers, oh, you cannot claim this until, say, 2 years ahead when you finish that book that you've been working on.
If you want art to flourish, you have to allow for the imagination of the artist. And many artists function in a wider traveling way, and some artists function in a narrow way. Cézanne sat in his room for 40 years painting still life, but he's not the only kind of artist in the world.
Revenue Canada phoned me when I was on the Jack Webster show, and they said it doesn't make any difference if you burn your work. I was absolutely devastated. I have never been so upset in my whole life, you know, and I thought, you bastards, I mean, why are you saying this to me? It's all for nothing. I mean, I've come the whole way, and now you're telling me it's all for nothing.
Onley's fire was doused by an 11th hour telegram from Communications Minister Francis Fox.
I'll be meeting shortly with my colleague, the Minister of National Revenue, on the subject, and will present to the best of my ability the concerns of Canada's artists, and will prompt you to reconsider, at least for the present, further action. This is the great wheel of government is just beginning to move. I got a telephone call from Joe Clark, and I was very, very impressed with his concern.
The people upon whom we rely most, our creative people, are in very many ways the least powerful.
What took a long time was to actually get legislation passed, and that took the better part of 7 years.
Had this kind of problem been faced by a multinational corporation, there wouldn't have been a 7-year delay and the need to threaten to burn their works. They would have found a way to change the system.
Artists are not a business like any other business. It's quite a different thing. I mean, we're the keepers of the culture sort of thing. We're not a business in that sense.
They are the definition of who we are. We talk about what makes us a community different from Europe, different from the United States, different from other places. Well, it is by and large the definitions and the perceptions of the creative among us.
Tony's gave the impetus to huge changes in the tax system, changes which not only affected visual artists such as themselves, but in the end affected writers, performing artists, musicians, everybody.
My main charity is Canada-India Village Aid. Nobody's heard of it, you know, but it's a group of friends here in Vancouver. We get together and we raise money and we do self-help projects in India. The first project we did in India was a hospital in an extremely poor area. It was a project that was started by a friend of the Woodcocks. He was giving a talk actually at the Hyatt. Very few people showed up. The Woodcocks were there. I went. I turned to George and I said, you know, how much money are we going to make out of this? He said, God, we're going to be lucky to make expenses here tonight, you know. And I said, you know, this is crazy, George. I said, why don't you and I do what we do best? I mean, you're Canada's man of letters. I have a fair reputation as a painter. Why don't we go to India together and do a beautiful book on India? I'll paint and you write. So we did that, you know. It was wonderful. He said, I think that's a great idea. So we did it. And within a month, I mean, we were in India together. Stayed in palaces and stayed in flea bag hotels and shared rooms with rats and things like that. I mean, it was what George called the luck of the road. Wherever we wound up, we'd stay. The worst thing that could happen would be the best writing that would happen. We would be bumping along, you know, in these little ambassador cars, and George would have his pen held up like this and a pad, and we'd go over a bump and they'd separate, and then finally he'd write down one word, usually just one word. That would jog his memory for a whole chapter in the book. Get to the hotel or wherever we were at nighttime, he'd write it all out, you know. And he'd rarely make revisions. I mean, that was it, you know. These are one shot. It's like me painting watercolor, one shot. Remember one night, we were talking about the title of the book, and George said, well, what are we going to call this book? I said, well, I've been thinking, George, that there's the walls between the rich and the poor. There's the walls between different religions, walls between languages, walls between the castes. And I said, why don't we call it The Walls of India? He said, that's a great idea. You know, so that's what we call the book, The Walls of India. I didn't just paint the landscape. Most of the paintings are of walls. We made over $100,000 or so out of that book. And with that money, we started a training program at the Kabliji Hospital, bringing in women from about 25 villages around. And we trained them over a period of about 4 years as medical workers, sort of barefoot doctors. But if you train people, you're not going to lose that. They'll train somebody else. And it goes on, and it just grows. It's like throwing a stone into a pond, as George called it. He said it just goes out and ripples.
My father and we went on a 2-week painting expedition from Alexandria on the Mediterranean all the way to Aswan in the south. And Dad painted, and this was new work for him. And the following year, I was teaching Middle Eastern history at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. They had an art gallery. At this point now, we have this huge collection of Middle Eastern watercolors that my dad had been painting in Egypt and Bahrain. So I proposed to the director, why don't we have a show of my father's Middle Eastern watercolors painted in the English tradition of watercoloring? And he went for it. And so we had an opening, a show entitled Landscapes of the Middle East.
I was taking off Chickamauga Glacier. It was in September and the snow was kind of sticky, and you need a lot more space to take off at high altitudes. I was going too fast to stop before I got to the first huge jarring crevasse, and I figured, well, if I try to slow down, I'll go into that crevasse and be killed for sure. So I kept the power on and leapt the first crevasse and landed into another crevasse. The engine broke off, the panel broke off, the whole front of the airplane broke off, and came around and jammed alongside of me, crushed my left leg. With the wings on the surface of the glacier and the body of the plane down on the crevasse, and about 200 feet below me, you know, fuel was pouring out of the gas tanks and the wings down over my legs, and I figured, you know, one spark and I'm up in flames. Turned all the switches off, and it didn't catch fire, and it cooled down. And I was with a photographer, actually, John Reeves. I was petrified I'd killed John because there was very dark blood coming out of the corner of his mouth. I sort of panicked, and I slapped his face, and John sort of came alive again, and he looked around, he says, "What kind of a dump is this? I hope they got a good wine cellar," he said, you know, and he tried to get out of the airplane. And I said, you know, John, you can't get out of the plane. If you do, you'll fall down in the crevasse. You can't even get off the glacier because the crevasses everywhere, you know. And I said, we have the only shelter between here and Vancouver. This is where we're going to stay until we get rescued. We were there all night. And I had an emergency locator transmitter. Anyway, they homed in on it. You know, it was 18 hours before we finally were rescued. And the next day they came in and early in the morning and picked us up and got us out of there.
I said to Tony, "My God, are you ever lucky?" And he said, "You're not kidding." He said, "If this had happened a day later, the Pope would have been in Vancouver and nobody would have paid any attention to my accident, whereas I'm first page coverage everywhere."
I think it was the experience of flying the plane around the BC coast that produced a completely new kind of Toni Onley.
He flies away from Vancouver. He depicts areas where people it isn't easy to get to.
It's a magical, mysterious, romantic image he creates around himself. The image of the artist as the outsider, the artist as the creative imagination, he's great at this stuff.
Being with my father, I get to go to the most incredible places, and I always have the most wonderful experiences. We can get out to a beautiful lake up in the mountains. That's really what it must feel like, going close to heaven. It's total magic. And then come home for supper.
When I step out of my airplane up in a high mountain glacial lake, I'm the first person probably to be in that particular spot, and one of the very, very few who have seen this place, you know. That's a wonderful feeling, you know, that it's a feeling about starting all over again, about beginnings, you know. You feel like you're Adam or something.
A recovery mission is underway for the body of Toni Onley, a prominent Canadian artist and Order of Canada recipient.
What caused this crash is unknown. The weather conditions were ideal.
The Coast Guard hovercraft and a dive team spent several hours scouring the river.
With Onley's plane wreckage now located, 2 buoys mark the spot. The degree of damage to the plane made it clear just how hard he hit. The fuselage was in 3 pieces.
They came from the world of art, media, business, and politics. Over 500 people came to pay tribute to a man described as a national treasure. His family doesn't look at today's memorial as a sad affair, but one of celebration.
Artists leave their work behind. And every time somebody looks at one of my paintings, even for a moment, I'm alive for that moment. So that's my eternity. My eternity is in my work and what I leave behind.